The last day of life for people condemned to death is a complex and emotional process. This dramatic and controversial topic raises profound ethical, legal, and humanitarian questions. During the final hours before execution, the procedures intended to prepare the condemned for their last moments of life are both rigorous and full of routine formalities. During this time, these individuals face enormous emotional and psychological dilemmas. Society and authorities also grapple with the moral and ethical consequences of carrying out the death penalty. Ted Bundy was a serial killer who spent his final moments in the death row cell at Florida State Prison in Stark. His last day of life, January 24, 1989, marked the culmination of one of the darkest sagas in American justice history. That day began very early for him. Despite the imminent execution, he remained calm, which was consistent with his general behavior during his time on death row. Bundy was focused, calm, and, according to witnesses, even courteous with the prison staff. The last meal he chose was typical of American cuisine: steak, fried eggs, toast, and hash browns. This simple dish seemed to reflect his attempt to maintain some normalcy in the face of imminent death. Bundy rejected the traditional dessert, vanilla ice cream, which could symbolize his final renunciation of attempting to prolong his life. In his final hours, Bundy also received a visit from a clergyman. These conversations focused on spiritual preparations for death. Although the details of these talks were never made public, it is known that Bundy, despite his initial denials, confessed to many unsolved crimes in these last days, which can be interpreted as his attempt to clear his conscience before dying. The media reaction to Bundy's execution was enormous. Reporters from across the country gathered in Stark to cover the event. Live broadcasts, expert analyses, and constant updates dominated television programs. The media focused not only on Bundy and his crimes but also on the debate over the death penalty. Many stations interviewed opponents and supporters of the execution, intensifying social tension. External reactions were equally intense. A crowd gathered outside the prison, counting down to the execution. Some expressed relief and satisfaction that justice had been done, while others protested against the application of the death penalty, holding signs and shouting slogans. When the time for execution arrived, Bundy was taken to the execution chamber, where his life ended in the electric chair known as Old Sparky. His last words, speaking of love and peace, contrasted with the brutality of his crimes, intriguing observers. Ted Bundy was one of the most notorious serial killers in U.S. history, and his execution represented an important moment in American criminal law and public debate. Aileen Wuornos was a convicted serial killer who spent her last day of life in the death row cell at Florida State Prison. Her case sparked many debates due to her difficult life and the brutality of her crimes. As October 9, 2002, the day of her execution, approached, Wuornos showed a mixture of resolution and calm not previously observed. In the days leading up to the execution, Wuornos had the opportunity to spend time talking with a clergyman and receiving final visits from close people. Some sources suggest she rejected many of these opportunities, choosing solitude and introspection. She also declined the offer of a special last meal traditionally given to those condemned to death, opting instead for a burger and fries from the prison canteen, a simple, unceremonious choice. Wuornos spent her final hours in her cell, where she spent most of the time watching television. For her, this was a way to disconnect from reality, although it was surely also a time for reflection on her life and impending end. When the time came, Wuornos was taken to the execution room. The execution procedure by lethal injection was carried out without incident. In her last words, Aileen Wuornos expressed her conviction about her innocence in the context of supernatural forces, claiming she was falsely accused and would meet God. Her death ended a tragic chain of events that began in her abuse-filled and difficult youth. Wuornos often spoke about her motivations and her past, which she said influenced her later actions. Although she was one of the few women executed in the United States, her story and motives were analyzed by lawyers, psychologists, and criminologists in the context of the discussion on the nature of evil and the social aspects of punishment. John Wayne Gacy, also known as the Killer Clown, spent his last day at the Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois, where he was condemned to death for murdering 33 young men and boys. His final moments, like his entire criminal history, served as a warning to society and were the subject of intense criminological and psychological studies. Gacy was sentenced to death by lethal injection, and his execution was scheduled for May 10, 1994. That day was filled with symbolic gestures and personal reflections for him. For his last meal, Gacy ordered an abundant plate consisting of KFC, his favorite brand of fried chicken, French fries, and large portions of strawberries. This was not only a metaphor for his life's pleasures but also a nod to his past when he ran 3 KFC restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa. During the final hours of his life, Gacy also received a visit from a clergyman, with whom he had long conversations. Previously, he had confessed to his crimes and frequently spoke about his life during the trial and his time in prison. His conversations with the chaplain likely focused on seeking forgiveness and spiritual peace, although he rarely expressed remorse publicly. In the final moments before the execution, John Wayne Gacy remained relatively calm. When the time came to take the final steps to the execution chamber, he maintained the composure that was characteristic of his attitude during the trial. In his last words addressed to the guards and observers, he expressed his final thoughts, which were not relayed as expressions of remorse or apologies to the victims' families. The execution of Gacy was carried out according to procedures, and death occurred quickly after the administration of the lethal injection. Gacy's death closed a chapter on one of the most disturbing criminal cases in U.S. history but left many unresolved questions about his motivations, psychology, and the justice system that allowed Gacy to evade responsibility for so long. Timothy McVeigh was the man responsible for the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, which killed 168 people and injured hundreds. He spent his last day at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana. His execution, which took place on June 11, 2001, was one of the most controversial and observed in modern U.S. history. During the final hours of his life, McVeigh remained calm and withdrawn. His attitude on the last day was consistent with his general stance since his arrest, expressing his conviction about the justice of his actions, arguing that they were a political protest against the federal government. McVeigh avoided large emotional outbursts and spent his final moments in isolation, contemplating his life and decisions. For his last meal, McVeigh chose something simple: 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. This simple dish was far from the elaborate last meals traditionally chosen by the condemned. This choice can be interpreted as an expression of indifference to the impending death or an attempt to maintain some control over the last aspects of his life. Instead of spending time in conversations with clergy or loved ones, McVeigh opted for solitude, consistent with his introverted character. He did not take the opportunity to receive visits from family or friends, which further underscored his isolation and determination. In the final hours before the execution, McVeigh was transferred to a special holding cell near the execution chamber. According to the procedures, he was dressed in the prison uniform and prepared for the lethal injection. Everything was carried out in an atmosphere of professionalism and calm, without unnecessary emotions or dramatics, reflecting McVeigh's cold approach to his own death. His last words, while not containing apologies or expressions of remorse, were reflective and centered on his ideological message. McVeigh, in the last moment, said, "I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul." This underlined his belief in personal responsibility and control over his life until the last moment. Carla Faye Tucker was a woman condemned to death for brutal murders. She spent her last day at the Mountain View Unit Prison in Gatesville, Texas. Her execution, which took place on February 3, 1998, attracted international media attention and sparked widespread debate about the role of women in the penal system and the ethics of the death penalty. Tucker was the first woman executed in Texas in over 135 years. Karla Faye Tucker experienced a significant transformation during her time in prison, becoming a born-again Christian, which had a major impact on her final days. She spent much time in prayer and conversations with clergy, which was also evident on her last day. Tucker was calm and focused, using the time to spiritually prepare for death, consistent with her religious beliefs. For her last meal, Tucker chose a modest plate consisting of a banana, a peach, and a cucumber salad. Her choice reflected the changes in her life and the rejection of past material pleasures in favor of simplicity. In the final hours of her life, Tucker was visited by close friends and clergy who supported her spiritually. These visits were a source of comfort and strength for her. The victims' families were also present, with mixed emotions ranging from anger to forgiveness, adding drama to those moments. During her transfer to the execution chamber, Tucker was calm. Witnesses described how she maintained eye contact with the chaplain and expressed her last words, which were an expression of hope to meet Jesus and peace after death. She spoke of her faith in salvation and God's mercy, which had a significant impact on those present. The execution of Karla Faye Tucker, carried out by lethal injection, proceeded without incident. Her death was a moment of reflection for many observers and critics of the death penalty, especially in the context of the possibility of rehabilitation and transformation of a condemned person. Ronnie Lee Gardner, condemned to death for murder during an escape attempt in a courtroom in 1985, spent his final moments in the Utah State Prison. His execution, which took place on June 18, 2010, was particularly notable because he chose to die by firing squad, a rare and controversial method. In the days leading up to the execution, Gardner expressed his desire to spend time doing activities that brought him peace. His last days were filled with tranquility and reflection. He decided to watch the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which he said allowed him to disconnect and enter another world. Gardner also chose his last meal, which consisted of lobster tail, steak, apple pie, and vanilla ice cream. This rich and abundant dish reflected his attempt to enjoy his last moments of life, in a sense, a symbolic farewell to the world where he could enjoy such pleasures. During his last day, Gardner spent time meditating and conversing with a clergyman, which was an important element for his spiritual preparation before death. His behavior was calm and determined, showing his willingness to accept the sentence. Before the execution, Gardner had the opportunity to speak his last words. His statements were brief and focused on wishing his family and friends to remember him as a person, not just as a condemned man. He expressed hope that his death would bring some kind of resolution to the victims' families. Execution by firing squad is rare in the modern penal system, which made Gardner's final moments even more notable. The condemned was tied to a chair in a specially prepared room, and his heart was marked as a target to ensure the shots were lethal. 5 shooters fired, with 4 bullets directly hitting Gardner's heart, ending his life quickly. Stanley Tookie Williams, co-founder of the Crips gang, experienced a profound transformation during his time in San Quentin prison. Condemned to death for a series of brutal murders, he became an activist for peace and gang violence prevention in prison. His last moments on December 12, 2005, were filled with tranquility and reflection. On the day of the execution, Williams maintained a stoic calm. His decision to reject a special last meal in favor of the standard prison menu was interpreted as a symbolic rejection of his past and an acceptance of his current state. He refused to have steak or ice cream, common choices among the condemned, opting instead for a simple and common meal. Williams spent his last day in conversations with a clergyman and receiving farewells from close friends and activists. Among the visitors were well-known figures from public life who supported his transformation and publicly appealed for his sentence to be commuted to life imprisonment. These moments were filled with emotional exchanges where Williams shared his reflections on life, transformation, and hope for the future. Accepting death with dignity, Williams used his last words to emphasize the message that had become the central point of his activism in recent years: the need to combat youth violence and the hope that his work would continue. He also expressed a plea for forgiveness and a call for mercy. His execution, carried out by lethal injection, was conducted in an atmosphere of calm, and Williams remained serene until the last moment. Williams's death not only ended his life but also intensified the debate on the death penalty, rehabilitation of offenders, and the possibility of change even for the most hardened criminals. Stanley Tookie Williams remained a controversial figure until the end but also an inspiration for many people both inside and outside the prison walls. Ricky Ray Rector was a condemned man whose execution in Arkansas in 1992 sparked a wide debate about the ethics of applying the death penalty, especially in cases of individuals with severe brain damage. Rector, who in 1981 killed a police officer and attempted suicide by shooting himself in the head, caused permanent and significant damage to his cognitive functions. On the day of his execution, January 24, 1992, Rector showed only a limited understanding of his situation. According to witnesses, his capacity to comprehend reality was considerably diminished. He did not understand what the execution meant, nor could he assimilate the information about his imminent death. His last day in the Cummins Unit prison was spent in an atmosphere of melancholy and controversy, highlighting the tragic consequences of his suicide attempt. For his last meal, Rector requested steak, fried chicken, chocolate cake, and fruit punch, a feast he consumed with apparent ignorance of the impending execution. It was reported that he left the dessert, saying he would eat it later, which was considered a sad testament to his misunderstanding of the situation. In his final hours, Rector was calm and adhered to his routines. He did not express emotions or reflections on his fate. His meeting with the clergyman also did not show any signs of awareness or understanding of what was to occur. When the time came for the execution, Rector was taken to the execution chamber where it was carried out by lethal injection. His death raised numerous questions about the morality of executing individuals with mental disabilities and the ability of courts to adequately assess the competencies of the condemned. The execution of Ricky Ray Rector remains one of the most controversial cases in the history of the U.S. penal system, symbolizing the profound ethical and legal challenges associated with the death penalty. Thank you for staying until the end. I hope you enjoyed this edition and remember to subscribe to the Daily Astonishing.